this is a set of questions from the methods paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to structure and model how to answer some of these. So for the focus group question, the 1A question, what it requires you to do is to always offer a definition of the term, 3 clear points, and use of the item. So that's what you've always got to do for the 1A 5 marker. Definition, 3 clear points, and use of that item. So this one is on focus groups. I think this is in 2019. So what I would do is I note that a focus group is a group interview. The focus group is a group interview. It's small. It is a small sample. Normally fewer than 10. So a focus group is a group interview. It is a small sample, normally fewer than 10, of respondents who discuss an issue or discuss questions whilst this is observed by a researcher. So a focus group is a group interview. It's a small sample, normally fewer than 10, of respondents who discuss an issue or discuss questions while this is observed by the researcher. That's the definition. Then what I normally do is I normally, where possible, try to use Grover to help me. So generalizability, reliability, objectivity, validity, ethics. Can't remember I said representative. Rep and gen, objectivity, validity, ethics, reliability. So I normally use it to try and help me. It doesn't always work. Sometimes the questions are too narrow and specific, but it does really help me. So focus group, that's my definition. It's a group interview, smaller than 10 normally, and they discuss topical questions. Focus groups are normally like a natural conversation. So they're normally like a natural conversation where respondents can feel free to express themselves. Focus groups are like a natural conversation. I'm going to put it, sorry, with open questions where respondents feel freely to express themselves. There's like a natural conversation with open questions where respondents can feel free to express themselves. Rapport or relationships can easily be built. Like a natural conversation with those open questions where respondents can feel free to express themselves, and rapport or relationships can easily be built. This increases the validity or truthfulness of so it increases the validity or the truthfulness of the responses. Okay. I would argue that's a clear point. I'm not sure if it's 2, I'm going to use that as a clear point. So I've done the validity bit there. Got a definition, it's a group interview. And it's like a natural conversation, increases the validity of the data. And then I think, right, so they're normally a sample of just fewer than 10. That's quite a large sample for a qualitative method. So the next clear point I'm going to make is that focus groups, because you should always be focusing on the term of the question, focus groups are more representative as they can access larger samples. They're more representative as they can access larger samples than semi-structured or unstructured interviews. Definitely presenting my screen, isn't it? To make sure it's its focus groups are more representative as they can access larger samples than semi-structured or unstructured interviews. This means they can account for key differences in society in terms of class, gender, and ethnicity. They're larger samples than semi-structured or unstructured interviews, so they can account for key differences in terms of class, gender, and ethnicity, which means you're more likely to be able to generalize or apply results. So they're a little bit better in terms of representativeness, which means you're more likely to be able to generalize or apply results. Not obviously as good as a questionnaire, but as qualitative methods go, much better. Rep and gen always go together as a pair. Definition, clear point, second clear point. Now I think to myself, oh, okay, there's some weaknesses there. It's not very reliable. Ethics, or I don't think that quite works. So then I think, oh, okay, well, I could use theory as a really good point. So I could note that interpretivists favour focus groups. Interpretivists tend to favour focus groups. As they are a micro perspective, and focus groups will allow respondents to discuss the meaning they attach to their actions. It's always about establishing the meaning to their actions. So that's a clear point as well. That's my third clear point. Currently, I only count 4 marks. My 5th mark has to come from the item. What I notice, is I've already read it, is that her study consisted of 17 unstructured interviews and 1 focus group. So what I'm going to pick up on here is that in the item, I'm going to make it really clear to the examiner, in the item, we can see the researcher conducted a focus group. This is likely, as this is because they only had 17 respondents. So they only had 17 respondents conducting the interviews, including a focus group would have increased the representativeness of the sample size. So I'm going to pick up on that point. Actually, they probably would have included the focus group because there was only 17 respondents, and having the focus group as well, it increases the sample size. Definition, 3 clear points and the item. I would note that a clear point, in my opinion, only comes when you've used some form of methodological term. So here it's validity. For this one, it is, where are you? Rep and gen, generalizable. I haven't put represent. This means that they're going to account for key differences, or, that's annoying, it's more representative. Good job I checked, it's more representative. So I would argue it only counts in a 1A if you're using a methodological term and it's well explained. So it makes it clear, you know, theory counts as well as a methodological term. Definition, methodological terms, and then use of the item there. In the 20 marker, skip over this one for the moment. In the 20 marker, what I always use is pervert. I've got pervert, but I use pervert. Pervert stands for practical issues, which is always time, money, and gaining access to a sample. Practical issues, issues, which is things like informed consent, anonymity, confidentiality. Just, you know, anonymity is when you use no names, confidentiality is when you don't use the details. So for example, if you were to say see, not using my name, so you wouldn't use the name Zadie, but confidentiality, you wouldn't use my details, so I was identifiable. So you wouldn't say a young female teacher at a young female sociology teacher at Itchin College, because it's getting quite obvious now who you're talking about. So anonymity and confidentiality, ethical issues. The R is reliability, the ability to be able to repeat. Can you get exactly the same thing over and over and over again? Validity, is it truth? Is it truthful? Is it accurate? Is it how you thought? Examples is when you've used 2 studies and you have incorporated the item. Representativeness and generalizability. And the T is theory. Positivism, interpretivism, realism. That's always the structure. And you should always be doing strengths and weaknesses of each one of those stages where possible. It's a guide to help you with these 20s. So, table. Practical, ethical, reliability, validity, rep, gen, theory. Okay, so for unstructured interviews, a really good tip with these 20 markers is that they really like to see a definition. So, definition, I'm going to note that an unstructured interview is an informal discussion with open questions. So it's like an informal discussion or conversation with open questions. It's an informal discussion or conversation with open questions that is guided often by the respondent. So they tend to be informal conversations with open questions, and it's often guided by the respondent. They're used on under-researched topics or highly sensitive areas. So if you know absolutely nothing about what it's like to be a new age traveller or a traveller, you need to be using an unstructured interview. You need to let them guide to you what it's like. Or we use them in very highly sensitive topics, namely things about crime and largely things around about domestic violence. So they are a conversation with lots of open questions, and they often guided by the respondent. We use them on under-researched topics or areas that are highly sensitive. So we've got practical, ethical, liability, validity, examples, rep gen, and theory. Missed one. Delete, insert row below. Theory. I know it's down here, otherwise the perverts doesn't quite work. But for theory, what I note is always the theory that favours it. So let me add another one row here, actually. That row column to the right. So you always do strengths and weaknesses. So for theory, what I note is that a unstructured interview is favoured by interpretivists. It's favoured by interpretivists as it offers a Verstein, love that word, Verstein approach, or enables us to have a deep understanding. It offers us a Verstein approach, or is able to offer us a deep understanding about the meaning people attach to their actions. It offers a Verstein approach and is able to give us deep understanding about the meaning people attach to their actions. However, for a positivist, it does not give us understanding. However, for a positivist, it doesn't give us understanding of a macro sociology. It doesn't give us any understanding of a macro sociology or large scale representations. So to clarify, interpretivists love a in-depth, detailed discovery and understanding about depth and detail about yourself, the meaning you attach to why you do things. However, for a positivist, an unstructured interview doesn't give you that macro, large-scale understanding and representation. So its use is limited. If it doesn't give me hundreds of thousands of people for a positivist, it's not worth it. I need to understand the big, large-scale perspective. So I start with definition, and then I normally go straight into theory here. And then I go practical, which again, to remind you, is time, money, and access. And with a unstructured interview, what I notice, they're incredibly time-consuming. So it's a weakness. They're incredibly time-consuming. The questions are all open to allow respondents to elaborate. Really time consuming. The questions are all open as it allows respondents to elaborate. They are also time consuming to transcribe. It's good practice when you've conducted an interview to type up the whole interview and send it to the person who gave you the interview so that they can read it through and agree that that's what they actually said. It's standard practice. They are also time consuming to transcribe as the researcher has to write the whole conversation. Really time consuming because the questions are open and they have to transcribe the whole conversation. They're also expensive as you often require a trained interviewer. It's very difficult to conduct a really good interview. So they're often expensive as you often require a trained interviewer. A skill is needed to probe respondents effectively. So I've done my time and money there, covered those two, said it's expensive and time consuming. Access. Again, I've read the item already and I know I have to refer to it, otherwise I lose a good 4 marks. But I know in the item that actually she's very tricky to gain access to them because they often have very difficult relationships with the police. So what I would note here is, in the strengths, is unstructured interviews can often provide access to difficult groups. In the item, we can see, so we've got the researcher's name, we can see that James, good idea to always use the researcher's name, that James, and don't miss gender either, so if you haven't read the item very well if you have not picked up on their gender. It's just a last name, again, do they. In the item, we can see that James used unstructured interviews to gain access because they have difficult relationships with the police. She uses unstructured interviews because she's gaining access largely because they have difficult relationships with the police. So building trust can ensure she gains access to this group. She uses it because it's a way to build trust. As they have very difficult relationships with the police. She's got to build that trust in order to gain access. In my ethical issues, I'd note that with unstructured interviews, anonymity, no names, and confidentiality are used. In Bunsel's study, she ensures that the British Sociological Association's guidelines So she adheres to the British Sociological Association's guidelines are adhered to. So guidelines are adhered to, as this ensures the safety of respondents and also increases the likelihood that they will be honest, increasing the validity. So ethical, you give them anonymity and confidentiality. And in Bunsel's study, she ensures that the British Sociological Associations are adhered to, as this ensures the safety of the respondents and also increases the likelihood that they will be honest, which increases the validity. So she has to do it because, they're female bodybuilders and they incur quite a huge amount of abuse. And some people are peculiar. So we have to ensure that the respondents are safe by not using their names or their details. I would note here as well, quite a long one this bit, is that we often use unstructured interviews on sensitive topics, particularly around issues. So we use them on sensitive topics. So for example, Dobash and Dobash, they are a husband and wife sociological team. And when they got married, and when they got married, she opted to take his last name, which is obviously a choice. But for Dobash and Dobash, that's why they have the same last name. And Dobash and Dobash, so unstructured interviews are used on sensitive topics. Dobash and Dobash use these when studying domestic violence. So they use unstructured interviews when they study domestic violence. As it ensures this sensitive topic can be explored sensitively. So for example, I appreciate Dobash and Dobash aren't on your sociologist grid, but they studied, as I say, domestic violence. And what they find is that statistically, domestic violence tends to happen, is most commonly happens during a woman's first pregnancy, obviously when she's quite at risk, which also helps to explain potentially why people may stay for long periods. They also conduct domestic violence that takes place within same-sex relationships as well, both with two women and two men. So when, for example, the victim is male and the perpetrator is male, she conducts the interviews because she's aware of her interviewer effect, that her gender may have an impact. They're aware that their gender may have an impact. When the victim is female and the perpetrator is female, he conducts the unstructured interviews. So being very aware there of their interviewer effect, that their gender can have some impact. But they use them on very sensitive issues, particularly around domestic violence. So Dobash and Dobash. Okay. In terms of ethical issues, in terms of weaknesses, we also note that they tend to put them in touch with people. So again, after the interviews, they tend to put them in touch. So ethically, unstructured interviews are pretty ethical, provided that they've adhered to anonymity and confidentiality. And I say I got that Dobash and Dobash example as well. We could note there, though, that there can sometimes be an issue. That's an interview effect, but I'll come back to that. I might put that in validity, actually. So for reliability, it's not reliable at all. It's only weaknesses. So unstructured interviews lack reliability, as the open questions mean you are unlikely to be able to give the same or similar answers in future. They're not reliable. You can't repeat them and get the same or similar responses because the questions are open. Can't be done. So it's just a weakness. For validity, the open questions mean respondents can explore the topic freely and that they don't have to answer, they don't have to approximate their answers. Means they don't have to approximate their answers. Explore their own topic freely, they don't have to approximate their answers. Rapport or relationships can be built with the interviewer, and this increases the truthfulness of the data and responses. However, the presence of an interviewer can cause respondents to give socially desirable answers. However, the presence of an interviewer can cause respondents to give socially desirable answers due to an interviewer effect. Just because I've been teaching lots of crime and deviance today, for example, it's why the crime survey for England and Wales uses a questionnaire. It's, for example, why the crime survey for England and Wales uses a questionnaire when asking about being a victim of domestic violence. So, however, the presence of an interviewer can cause respondents to give socially desirable answers due to an interviewer effect. For example, the crime survey for England and Wales, they use a structured interview, but when they get to the proportion of the interview where it asks about whether you've been a victim of domestic violence, they leave the room and they leave the questionnaire when asking about being a victim of domestic violence as an interviewer effect can decrease ability. It might, even changing the gender of the person interviewing somebody doesn't mean that they would be willing to tell you whether they've ever been a victim of abuse within their household. It's still likely to decrease it. Right, in examples, that's not a paragraph, that just there is a prompt. I have used the item and I have used Bunzel. I've also used Dobash and Dobash, and I have referenced the crime survey. But you'll be able to pop those bits in when you do second year, but it just helps to show your understanding. Right, I've used 2 studies and I have used the item. For rep and gen, again, it's not very representative or generalizable. It's too small. So when it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's not your fault. It's just, it doesn't work. It's just a negative. So in representativeness, so I say unstructured interviews have small samples. Unstructured interviews, sorry, have very small samples. So very small samples as the open questions makes it very time consuming. This means the samples can't represent. This means the samples are not large enough to represent or account for differences. Can't represent or account for differences. This also means the researcher can't apply or generalize results. I'm going to add in another study here because I appreciate Dobash and Dobash, you won't have covered Dobash and Dobash, and you won't have covered crime until the second year. So what I would note here is this is, so for example, in Jackson's study of lad culture, he has to use secondary sources that have a cross-sectional survey. So she has to use secondary sources that have a cross-sectional survey to generalize any results, as her samples are too small with an unstructured interview. That's how I would use the second study that you've covered. But actually, she has to use the secondary sources in order to make any claims or generalizations because the unstructured interviews are too small. Where she doesn't clarify to us exactly what her interviews were, we can use our own understanding when it applies to the question. Okay. It's how we do unstructured. Definition comes first. I then do theory, strengths and weaknesses, then practical, ethical, reliability, validity, and then they're done. It's really important to plan them and to try and use that pervert structure to just help plan. I just find it's helpful. If we look at the mark scheme from the examiner, unstructured interviews came up in 2019. When did it come up? Remind myself. Yeah, 2019. So he said to the examiner, definition. Oh, I like that. Based on a theme and flows like a conversation. Strengths should be explained in the context of key methodological concerns. So they should have used validity. They should have used rapport. They should have used Verstehen, should have used interpretivism. So this just highlights to you, again, what they would pick up on. So like Verstehen, interpretivism, validity is strengths and rapport. And participants can control the flow of information. So I've kind of touched on that. Weaknesses of unstructured should be lack of reliability. Yes. Can't generalize. Yep, said that. And I said that it was, yeah, I said that positivists criticize it because it's not macro. Give socially desirable answers, said that. Hard to analyze. No, that's a point I could probably add in there. It's difficult on time. Oh, no, I did say that. When we transcribe the interviews, they take time. And then again, the skills of the researcher. So I've covered the bullet points. And just to show you, if you have the item in 2 studies, you get 6 marks for AO2. Drawing upon those key methodological concerns, so validity, reliability, rep, and gen, it's 12 to 14. We try and use that pivot structure regardless. Doesn't, as I say, as you can see, there's sometimes gaps, but what we find is you draw out enough of the points in order to get that top band. So any questions or any issues, let me know.